Hi, Misha here, and I have a lesser known, at least today, British aircraft from World War II, the Bristol Blenheim. I actually have two models here, both from Corgi, 1/72 scale as usual, diecast. Over on the left we have the Mark I, set up as a night fighter, and on the right we have the Mark IV, set up as a bomber. This plane had a very interesting development history, very unconventional. Started off at Bristol, at least the jumping off point was their Type 135. Well, in 1934, Lord Rufford kind of challenged them to develop a fast personnel transport that could hold about half a dozen people. Bristol updated their design to be the Type 142. An order was placed in March, and the first prototype was ready by April of 1935. And it indeed was very fast. It went over 300 miles per hour, which was faster than military fighter interceptors of the day. And it was enough of a success that the RAF took notice with the Lord's kind of encouragement. In fact, he would donate his prototype craft. But the RAF would release specifications in the summer of '35, which would directly lead to the Type 142M for militarized, which in turn would lead to the Mark I Blenheim. It is a relatively small plane. It's under 43 feet long, with a wingspan of about 56 feet. 2 engines. It was really one of the first to have an all-metal skin versus wood canvas. Obviously it's a monoplane design, monowing. So yeah, let's get into the details and kind of the differences. Alright. As I said, the Type 142M was the militarized version to meet RAF specs that were released in 1935. The biggest change was they moved the wing upward on the fuselage to allow for a bomb bay. Obviously, they also added some armor and defenses. The original Mark I wasn't super heavy, though. It had one .303 machine gun and a dorsal turret in the back. However, this was a pretty advanced turret for its time. It was the first British bomber to have a powered turret. It also had a single .303 machine gun in the port wing root. It used Mercury air-cooled radial engines. It had retracting landing gear, which was a first for RAF. Had a crew of 3, pilot, navigator and bombardier, and radio operator and gunner. It could carry a maximum bomb load of 1,200 pounds, but 1,000 was typically the most it would have, usually 2 500-pound bombs. The nose was this kind of glazed cockpit, single shape for speed, aerodynamics. Also, the body was left pretty narrow and long for speed. The first military prototype flew in 1936, with the first deliveries to squadrons in 1937, early, and these started to appear in overseas colonies throughout 1938 and into India by 1939. It was kind of the RAF's de facto light bomber at the time. Unfortunately, all the militarizations had decreased its overall speed. Like I said, the prototype, the commercial version, which originally was, by the way, known as the Briton, the name Blenheim would be attributed later during the military process. Anyway, it got over 300 miles per hour. Well, the military plane couldn't quite reach 270 miles per hour and had a cruising speed of under 200 miles per hour. Also, its maximum ceiling was under 30,000 square feet. But I digress. While it was advanced in some ways, it also had some major deficiencies. The cockpit was one. If you can't tell, this is very cramped for both the navigator and the pilot. The pilot had a hard time getting to his instruments, and the navigator was kind of squinched in down there. Also, the bomb doors were just bungee cord. So when they would release the cords, the bombs themselves would just fall out under gravity, which obviously wasn't really a great way to aim. So they would make improvements, actually going all the way back to 1937, the prototype of what would become the Mark IV would fly. But we'll get to that in a minute. And the Mark IV would start to go into squadron service right before war in September of 1939, meaning the majority of planes were still the Mark I. These were used early on in many roles, even if they weren't best suited. That RAF had to kind of make do with what they had. They were, of course, used as a light bomber. In fact, the first bombing raid of the war in September of 1939 was, well, the first Allied bombing raid. A British bombing raid was carried out by mostly Mark I Blenheims. These were also stationed in France and used during the Battle of France, and several were on hand during the Dunkirk evacuation. They were also used throughout 1941 to attack maritime vessels. In fact, the first RAF plane to sink a U-boat was a Blenheim. That was in March of 1941. They were continually used to bomb airfields, power stations, so on and so forth throughout 1941, but they were getting their asses handed to them. Loss rates were unacceptable for a few reasons. One, while this was a very advanced plane and very fast for 1935, by already 1940, it was slow. It was going up against newer versions of the Messerschmitt, and soon the Focke-Wulf would join the fray, so it was outclassed. Also, its armament, with only 2 303 machine guns, although the turret gun was upgraded to Vickers. And of course, its bomb load was not terribly heavy or accurate, and the cramped cockpit didn't help. But the RAF still had a need, And they had thousands of these, so they continued to use them. And that leads me to this specific version here. In addition to being a light bomber, they tried out using these as a fighter. What they would do, instead of a bomb bay, well, kind of under the bomb bay, with it fixed closed, they would install a gun pack with 4 .303 machine guns. Now, originally they tried using these as daytime fighters in 1939, kind of out of desperation. That didn't work great. So by 1940, and by the Battle of Britain, they started using these more and more as night fighters. And this plane was actually very well suited for that early on, because it was big enough to carry early airborne radar sets. It wasn't until much later that a single-engine plane could carry a radar set. So they would keep the gun pack, and they would install a night radar, and this would become the Mark 1F. And these were used during the Battle of Britain, and were pretty successful. I mean, all things considered. It was small enough to not just be a huge target, but also big enough to carry the necessary equipment. It was a stopgap measure, admittedly, but a pretty darn effective one. And these would continue to be used on and off as fighters until newer, more advanced planes were available. So what about our Mark IV? If this video seems a bit rushed, it's because while I was setting up for it, my lunch came. A jalapeno bacon cheeseburger. So forgive me. But I'm a professional, so I'm going to finish this before I eat. Then again, I'm an unpaid professional, so I think that just makes me an idiot. But, oh well. The Mark IV. This actually started off as a different plane, known as the Bolingbroke, the Bristol Bolingbroke. The Mark II had been a long-range version with extra fuel tankage, but only a prototype was made. The Mark III had a redesigned cockpit and other upgraded changes. And so when we get to the Mark IV, it's really the next major version to go into full production. And it was kind of renamed from the Bolingbroke to the Blenheim 4. Like I said, the first prototype flew, or what would become this flew. By the way, the company designation was Type 149. It first flew in late 1937, with the first production models available in 1938. And right around the beginning of World War II, Britain had about 150 of these in service with production ongoing. Mark I production would actually be halted by 1940. Actually, I think 1939, but they used what parts they had to finish them up. So Mark IV production would be the primary production until it was all ended by 1942-43. So the differences. They tried to correct some of the deficiencies. First off, we went to more powerful Mercury engines. Obviously, we can lift more. We also added additional fuel tanks in the wings, although early Mark IVs did not have these. The most noticeable difference is the longer nose. This gave room for the bombardier. It also gave better view. It gave the pilot more space. You can see kind of the scoop out. for him to view there. Still had a crew of 3. Early Mark IVs would still have a single Vickers gun, 303 in the rear, but soon the turret would receive a second 303 machine gun. Would still retain the machine gun in the wing. We would also add a blister down here for the bombardier to use that has another machine gun that fires towards the rear. It'd be really hard for me to show you. It's kind of cool though, little machine gun. It does move on this model. It tucks up for flight and it drops down. So they doubled the machine gun defenses, taking it from a staggering 2 to a blistering 4. I think some versions might have even had 5 with 2 machine guns in that blister. It also slightly increased the bomb capacity. These could also carry small bombs on the wings externally, like little 50-pounders. Yeah, those were the major updates and differences. Some of these would also be converted to night fighters, known as Mark IVs, but not near as many as the Mark I. As I said, Mark I's made the first bombing raid from Britain of the war. Actually, a Mark IV made the first reconnaissance flight over the German fleet and port during September 1, so opening day of the war. And these would be used during bombing raids in Europe throughout 1940 and 41. But again, their survivability wasn't great. So what they did is newer models became available. These would be transferred more either to the home front or the Middle East. And then after Japan joined the war, several will be transferred to Southeast Asia and continue to see service there. They would be used as bombers and attack fighters. Some would also be used as reconnaissance planes. And then finally they would be used as trainers. Like I said, by 1943 production was over. And really by 1944, most if not all were out of service. Or at least were retired to training planes. And they would build total, including licensed production in Canada and Finland, a bit over 4,400. The Mark IV was nearly the last variant. There was a Mark V, but not that many were made. It was a more heavily armored version. And instead of having the glass nose, it had a gun pack in the front. So it was used as more of a ground attacker. It was okay successful, but yeah, it was pretty slow, honestly, and by the middle of the war it was pretty dated and vulnerable. So it was only really useful if there was air superiority. Also, the Blenheim is important because it led to the Bristol Beaufort, which led directly to the Bristol Beaufighter, which was another twin-engine, two-seater, used for all kinds of roles during the war. Dive bomber, regular bomber, torpedo bomber, ground attacker, close support, night fighter. I've done a video on it as well, so you might want to check that out. Now that plane in that video is a Hobbymaster. Like I said, these are both Corgi. And the reason I have two is simply this one's been out for a long time, a couple of years at least. And I thought it was really neat to have an RAF night fighter. I love the little tiny gun pack on the bottom. Little details like that tickle me. The turret also moves. Of course, gear up or down. Obviously, the bomb bay can't open because of the gun pack. This one just came out. In fact, I just got it a week or two ago. I had put it on pre-order with Pete's Collectibles, and when it came in, I hadn't bought anything too recent, and I said, what the hell, just send it. Can't hurt. And I'm glad I did. It's just different enough to make it worth having. I really think that blister with the moving gun is a neat touch. Of course, it has the same turret in the back. Wheels up or down. And of course, it has the longer nose. I don't know if the bomb bay is open, though. I haven't really tried. Some of these Corgis, when they're new, I'll think the bomb bays are fixed. But some of them actually come in hinged, which is pretty neat. So I'll have to check it out later. Others have plug-in bomb bays like a Hobby Master would. Either way, these are both nearly entirely metal, with really only the plastic being like the turrets and propellers and guns and stuff. Corgi's pretty good about being solid. But, yeah, I figured I've got all the other British bombers from the medium and heavy fleets, so might as well have some light bombers and also have this fighter to sit next to my Beaufort. And again, not really anyone else is doing videos on British planes, so, hey, you get me. I do the best I can. Appreciate you tuning in and sticking with me. And feel free to comment. With that said, I'm going to go eat my burger now. I will catch you very soon next time.